welcome to everybody. A really balmy evening here in southwest France to a very interesting talk by Trevor Griffiths, who's got an extremely interesting background, as you see, because he studied medicine, neuroscience, and immunology, and then was in medicine for a long time. And he then developed this emotional literacy and emotional logic. And so he's become a coach full time. And we're going to find out more about that this evening. And you'll see that he's using some of the David Bohm terminology, implicate order, hollow movement at the inner human heart. And I'm really looking forward to finding out what that means. And also his key question, do brains filter out our connection into life? I think that's a very, very interesting question as well, coming from a sort of neuropsychological point of view. And while you're on, I will put a link to a Spectator article on consciousness by Kit Wilson this week, which is extremely interesting because it finishes up questioning materialism, which is almost unheard of in a kind of mainstream publication. So maybe we're making some progress after all. So Trevor, it's a great pleasure to have you with us this evening, and we're looking forward to what you have to share with us.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for the welcome, for the invitation. It's great to spend a bit of time with you, and I'd like to be sharing a range of thoughts that have developed. Have I frozen, by the way, or not?
No, you're fine.
Just on mine, it seems to have done. But anyway, so I've got a PowerPoint to share. I'll take you through. So if I can share screens on this now. And how does that look? Is that coming through for everybody?
Yep, looks good.
So thank you. So the theme, between the seconds of your mind, and this is, as you mentioned, thanks David, based on David Bohm's concept of the implicate order behind the explicate order that we live amongst, where he is describing it all being hollow movement, that there's movement. And this talk, as you see from the title, is about how we perhaps connect into that through our inner hearts. So my main focus in this talk is around the human mind. We sit in the middle of two enormous scales, the telescopic of the universe and the microscopic scale, and these both meet in the way our minds work. And one of the things that really struck me as I looked at both of these scales with interest as a scientist is how everything rotates or vibrates. Everything's in movement. And as I, through my studies, got more involved in the way the brain works, I came to realize that there is a particular feature of the way our brains help us get organized in space and in time and in the sense of substance that we're part of, that actually screens out some of our awareness of our relatedness in life and converts it into static objects. And that's going to be the main theme of this talk, is what is going on that our brains construct certain ideas that where everything is moving, everything's in turmoil. Somehow we've developed through our brains the idea that there is static matter. Now, I went to Oxford to study medicine. I was a bit of an unusual student in that I didn't have the traditional push bike to get around. I had a motorbike and quite enjoyed sort of driving it around a little bit fast at times and so on. But I had a wide range of interests there, not just medicine, but immunology, macromolecular studies of the cell membranes and so on. But also I was what I call a seeker after truth. I'd had a number of religious experiences, things that didn't quite make sense. I had explored churches, but couldn't quite get on with traditional religion. I'd explored through Zen, of course, originally starting with that iconic book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, of course, but taking it on a little bit from there. And into I Ching and the idea of divination, but then realizing, why on earth do we need sticks or stones to engage with this world through divination if actually our inner hearts are connected in there as well, if we are connected in there as well? So I moved on from that into more an intuitive sort of prayerful search, but without any formal structure to that. And in the midst of this search, I was also writing a bit of poetry, you know, as students do. And one day in this frame, out came this particular poem, which I'd like to read to you and tell you a bit of a story behind this. Angles turn and lines forgive crisscrossing of the mind. For here in the world there is beauty, such as always found between the seconds of your mind. So that poem came out while I was there, I wrote it down, and I suddenly got this feeling that I needed to get on my motorbike and drive, and that I was going to have to give that poem to somebody. So just intuitively, I just did that. It's a bit cool at the time, so I put a jumper on and a jacket and put the poem on the inside pocket, and then put my outer jacket on to go on the bike, and set off and drove out from the centre of Oxford, got out to a semi-industrial area on the edge, and then suddenly thought, that's it, I've arrived. So I pulled off the road, got off the bike, and I was expecting somebody to come by and that I'd know that I ought to give this poem to them, and nobody came. So I started exploring around, reached inside, couldn't find the poem. Searched everywhere, went back to the flat, couldn't find the poem anyway, it had disappeared. And because of the sort of experiences that I've been having, I was just going to say, right, well, that's a mystery. You know, of course I could have just dropped it somewhere, of course. But actually it was very securely wrapped up under 2 secure levels of clothing on the way out. And I just was willing to hold that. But I think as you'll see as we go along, this poem actually becomes quite relevant. So that was what I would call a psi event. But then something more significant happened. While there, I had a dream one night, and it was a dream that foretold the future so accurately that it saved my life. I dreamt I saw my death on the motorbike. I won't go into the details of the dream, but there were 2 stages to it, one of which alerted me to the next scene in which I was knocked off sideways. And so I started driving a bit more sensibly and carefully, but it was a month or so went by and nothing happened. And of course I went back to my old ways, which were, you know, a little bit, you know, get in and out around the cars and enjoy what you're doing and so on. But a situation arose then where something really strange started to happen, and I thought, this is it. And at that moment, I was about to do something. I'll come back and tell a bit more about this later. I chose to do the exact opposite of my natural thing, which would have been to accelerate and overtake 3 cars at the same time. And instead, I jammed on the brakes, pulled back behind the last car, and something remarkable happened. The car at the front, the first one, did a most unusual maneuver, spun 180 degrees in the middle of the road and zoomed off in the opposite direction. And it undoubtedly would have knocked me off and killed me. So I was alerted to a situation by that dream. And as far as I'm concerned, because I am sort of a scientist in my way of approaching things, that was a dream that broke the traditional scientific laws of time. The science is based on the view of the arrow of time from past to the future, causal effects, causal chains. And this was something that broke that causal chain. So to be honest, every day that I live, this event is still as fresh in my mind as ever. I'm alive because of an event that broke the rules of space and time. And that set me off on a search saying, science is definitely delving into something, but it's not the whole story. There's a lot more that we need to explore. So I was part of neuroscience studies, studying the cat's sort of visual cortex and taking part in experiments with, you know, single nerve microelectrode recordings and so on. So I'm quite used to the idea of the brain working with patterns of activity. But the problem was that I felt sorry for the cat. So I decided I wasn't really a lab researcher, and eventually left a PhD and go back into medical studies again, because I wanted to be a researcher in life. And I was keen on immunology and the immune diseases and so on, and realized that both neuroscience and immunology, they're both pattern recognizing systems, that we as an organism are detecting patterns with distance senses in the neuroscience and the immunologies with chemical patterns, with recognizing what's self and what's other. And that is all part of our identity as a person. It's at a physical level and at a social and wider environmental level. But in all of that I was studying, I knew something was missing from science, and it was to do with relatedness, to do with relationship. I was looking at communication patterns between cell populations in health and disease, but decided to leave in the end to go into medicine, where I took a particular interest in family medicine and systemic work, because the patterns of communication amongst people I found were reflected in the patterns that the brain was detecting in the environment, and the understanding how the immune system worked on pattern recognition and responsiveness. The same thing was going on in families and in communities, neighborhoods, workplaces. So I was forming this idea of identical principles of organization. Principles of organization, that's a core thing that I'm going to be talking with you about, because it's about this area that I believe I'll be able to give an explanation of these two psi events that broke the rules of space and time. We're getting into the level of communication patterns and relational patterns. Now, I also put the picture here of Schrödinger's cat. And what I'd just like to say is that this thought experiment about the quantum level of life, I believe, is completely fallacious. The reason is that it's not the cat or any of the things here, it's in a box. And the thought experiment relies on that box being screened off until somebody opens the lid and looks at it. And then that is the input of energy into this closed system that determines what happens. The problem is that science has recently shown that the universe is not a closed system, which is the picture that what I call Enlightenment science for the last 300 years has all been based on. It's the idea that the universe is a closed system bounded by space and time, and that matter moves with momentum and bounces around inside this box and so on. But in 2011, three physicists, Pimita, Schmidt and Rice, got the Nobel Prize for Physics for proving that the universe is not only still expanding, but the rate of expansion is accelerating. Right? So we are part of a universe that is expanding at an ever-increasing rate. Now that means the universe of which we belong is an open system. It has to be an open system. And I'm sorry to disappoint people, but all the rules of thermodynamics to do with entropy and energy preservation and so on are all framed within the concept of closed systems. They do apply in closed systems, but at a universal scale in which we human beings are embedded, it's an open system, and those rules may not apply. And that's what I'm going to be saying to you. They actually do not apply at the level of the human heart. Karen Barrad, of course, has done a lot of work on the concept of intra-action. We human beings are interactive in this universal scale, also in local systems. And it's up to us by our choice of action, whether we create closed systems and believe in them, or whether we live as if we are part of an open system. So I came up with this thing. There's a lot of neuroscientists are keen on the idea that the brain is actually a social brain. It isn't there just to give us a sense of who we are and for us to generate feelings internally. It's not an individualistic thing. The brain is there to map our relatedness and to map our relationships. And I found from my developing interest in Celtic Christianity, because it's very earth, it's very rooted in the community, in hospitality, in the rhythms of nature. To me, this is where the life of things are generated. And the Celts already had this image called a triquetra, three corners, a shape that is 3 points, but not a triangle, or triquetra, 3 corners. And it's an icon of never-ending movement, of continuous dynamic. If you follow the lines along, you know, it just goes round and round. And when you fit 2 together, the relatedness goes backwards and forwards between them. And this is eternal movement. And this is how I'm going to be displaying what I believe is David Bohm's concept of hollow movement. Now, these 2 icons of movement, the triquetra, are icons that can be scaled to lots of different levels. It's the principles of organization of movement. Movement is the changing relatedness of forms, changing relatedness of forms. So this could represent two adults talking together, a conversation. It could be in Celtic Christianity, God and humanity in a conversation. It could be a mother and child. But also, I'm going to be putting to you that this could be an icon that represents quantal change. This could be a gardener and the earth, that you could have a relationship with your garden to cultivate and bring forth fruitfulness from the land. And the idea of having two of these self-organizing elements that meet together into a conversational relationship is that one becomes an ecology for the other. This is an ecological picture of the human being, an ecological picture in which the environments scale from the quantal to the universal and to the social and the inner world. And in this, I'm going to introduce the word information. And the core thing in this is because I'm proposing that everything is in movement. Information is a verb, it's not a noun. It is the forming, following this along, the change that's going on in this person here is transferred relatedness over to here to it transforms the other person. And this is information. It's a dynamic. It's not a noun. And this is, and what I'm proposing is that this type of iconic relationship or relatedness is synergy. This is a vibration. One movement happening here induces movement here, and that reflays back. And here we have synergic movement backwards and forwards. This is an image, an icon of relatedness. So there's mutual repatterning, which is synergy. Now, this is actually the core slide of the talk, and I'm going to come back to this slide right at the end of it, just to pull it all together at the end. Now, in that mutuality of repatterning, there is bidirectional informational flow. And a lot of science is based in a linear concept of energy transfer or of information transfer from a transmitter to a receiver. We're coming back to that a little bit later. But in systemic family therapy, the network of relationships and the communications that go back and forth, a group of people, form a state of action going on within the family. And that state can either bring on helpful behavior or it can become chaotic or turbulent. That's where the social brain is connecting with it. And the core principles of organization, I believe, are shaping what goes on in the brain to engage with this conversational reality. And that is what's called the explicate order. This is the level we live in our social settings, set in environments. And that picture on the right of the lady looking at that artwork on a piece of, on a UK post box, it just shows the explicate order can get into a bit of a knot, can get all tied up when things get a bit stressed. But underneath that, David Bohm is saying that there is an implicate order of wholeness, a whole movement. And I believe that the inner human heart connects into that at an informational level where one is transforming the other through this synergic connection. And that this synergic connection lies behind what we describe as energy matter in the explicate order, right? So movement emerges from the implicate order out into an explicate order where our brains organize it into a concept. So when I was studying neuroscience, this is absolutely basic neuroscience, well established, that there are what are called sensory association areas in the brain, where particularly the distance senses are all brought together to construct certain impressions. I'm not going to go into this in any detail at the moment, but I just want to say that it is well known that this parietal cortex area here generates a concept of space. And if there are lesions or illnesses that affect this area, it'll be affecting our spatial awareness. This area of the frontal lobe, underneath and in the middle, is involved in sensing time. And this is the one that I really want to draw your attention to. This temporal lobe, sensory association area, that brings together, your visual, balance, auditory, touch, sensations, body or a body image and so on, all integrate here. They pull together memories as well. And so we get meaningful association with our ongoing sensory experience is generated in these three different areas. Now, the point about the temporal lobe one is this is where there are some unusual effects that come from epilepsy affecting this area or any other illnesses. And they can make life seem unreal. What's going on here is something called object recognition, which is easiest described by, for example, talk about a bicycle. The bicycle looked at from different angles looks totally different. And yet we somehow develop an idea that this is a bicycle. There's something solid there called a bike, and it looks like this from different angles, right? And that is what's being pulled together in this area of the brain. So it gives a sense of real present object recognition. Now, when I started to apply the triquetral image of what's happening here, these change and form and relatedness are features of our sensory input, which are coming into this dynamic where the brain is constructing an organized sense of the world out of chaotic neural experience of senses coming in from all angles and memories coming in together. And it's happening here. And these three areas, these 3 points, coordinate by pairing their inputs in these different areas. So if we were just to look a little bit more at forms, shapes of things and the relationship of forms, if those two things come together, it creates a sense of space. If forms are changing, a pendulum swinging, gives you a sense that there is time on the move. And this is the one that I want to draw your attention. If this theory is true, and this is a hypothesis, I'm putting it to you as a hypothesis that could be tested, then if these 3 sensory inputs can be integrated in these sensory association areas to generate a sense of space and of time and of real presence, then the other pairing is of the change of relatedness. And what I mean by that is, let's imagine you're walking along and suddenly you bang your hand against the edge of a table that you haven't particularly noticed, right? You will think there's a solid table there, right? But actually what's happened is that your hand has had a change of relatedness, and that has got converted through your object recognition temporal sensory association area into the sense that there's a solid object there. If somebody walks into a room, if there's a change of relatedness, you might get the sense that there's a real presence of someone in the room. So out of changes of relatedness, we develop a concept of substance. There's a substantial person come in. If someone says, feel the quality of this cloth, you don't just put a fingertip against it and say you're feeling the quality. You move your hand over it, and you get a changing array of sensory input that associates with your memories and gives you a sense of the substance of this material that you're touching. So this is object recognition. Any sense of objects that we have around us is actually constructed from a whole history memorized of our changing relatedness with our environment. From the time when we were babies, gumming things that we put in our mouths and so on, right the way through, we're accumulating a sense of textures and qualities that we change our relatedness with, and we shape this idea that things are real objects. So this is a fairly complicated idea, but I just want to put it to you as a theory. And I'm put this icon up here, the core icon, just to emphasize that this process going on in the brain is part of the social brain. All of these 3 are inputs from our environment that the brain is organizing in order to make a response. And these 3 are project forward to the motor areas here. That's what's going on in this central space. And it's in the motor areas where we prepare our responses that these 3 sense of space, time, and objects of substance become properly integrated into a sense of me, myself in this environment. So I spent a bit of time explaining that, but this is a core to it. So this is just sort of restating what I've said. David Bohm's implicate order of movement is the changing relatedness of patterned forms, the changing relatedness of patterned forms. And that sense of space and time and a substantial reality around us is what we mean by the explicate order. That is it. We have what I call an orientation horizon. A lot of our experience are placed in this sense of orientation in space and time and substance. But if you think about it, there's an awful lot of our experience which is below the orientation horizon, which is not orientated. And the simplest, most obvious one to say is the sense of smell. That activates you, that alerts you, but it actually alerts you to search with your distant senses for what the source of that smell is. Yeah, so the sense of smell is not actually orientated, right? But it drives us to seek orientation, to bring in this explicate order to a set of experiences that are below that orientation horizon. And this is what I would like to be proposing to you, that this is what I mean by the inner human heart. It's a whole range of awareness and sensitivities that is below the orientation horizon. And a lot of it is to do with emotion, with emotion. A lot of it, the emotion, comes from our values and how we interact with the world around our values. Emotion is energy in motion. And emotion is values in from energy entering our awareness. This is where I'm proposing to you that our inner human hearts are actually connected into an implicate order way beyond what we are aware of in our conscious minds as being above the orientation horizon, as an explicate order. Now, these informational movements that are shown in the double triquetra can scale up. And I'm not going to spend too long on this, but when they connect together, what was a synergic vibration just between two of them can start to become a progressive wave of movement through networks of movement changes. Remember, all of these triquetra are not solid objects. They are icons of movement, the changing relatedness of patterned forms. And here we're beginning to see patterned forms. Whoops, that was moved on. But so I'll just take that back. Oh, sorry. Here we go. This is going to be a bit unusual now. Anyway, so just sorry about the interruption there. But the point I wanted to make from that previous slide is that the synergic movement can translate into progressive movements through that implicate order, which we'll come back to in a moment. But this is what science measures. Science is measuring the movements through, the linear movements through what I'm going to be describing is what I believe is the implicate order, and describing it in terms of these networks of triquetral movement. Now, this lovely sculpture here is just a beautiful picture of the types of conversational orientation that I'd like to sort of capture for you. The iconic representations can be true in networks of people or at the level in the implicate order, even of quantum gravity. It's the same principles of movement that are on the go. Now, in quantum theory, there's something called quantum field theory, which has run into problems because it's based on particles. And it says that around particles, there's a quantum field of energetic activity. And it's run into one or two problems. And I want to mention at this stage, because what I'm proposing about triquetral implicate order is that it's actually much more pervasive than related to the particles. The particles emerge out of it. And I'm also going to be proposing that waves, in fact, emerge out of this implicate order. So the idea of quantum fields around particles is approaching it in the wrong direction. Now, I believe that looking at this level of an extensive implicate order, out of which emerge particles and waves and eventually emerge all of the dynamics that we call explicate order, which our brains have evolved to detect, to engage with, to construct an impression of this world so that we can talk to each other sensibly and cooperate to manage life and manage our environments together. And all of that going on over incredibly long time frames and so on. But I believe that this implicate order relatedness can provide a cosmological explanation for the disappearing poem and for the dream that broke linear time. And that's where we're going to be going with all of this. And I'd like to be proposing that the concept of inform energy in this implicate order, that the movements that are set up through it, there are harmonics that are running through it. I believe the vibrations extend into sort of a harmonic whole. But it gets diversity is inherent to the way these triquetra connect together. We'll be looking at that a little bit more. And because there is diversity within this implicate order, there is information. One part informs the other of the movements that are going on within this implicate order. And that emerges into our experience of life. We're connected into it, but we try to make sense of it in our explicate order, but our brains, unfortunately, have a weak spot in that what is relatedness at the level of the implicate order and change of relatedness in unusual patterns there, our brains convert into the idea of solid objects. So of course my motorbike existed, of course the car existed, of course the poem existed, it was a solid object, wasn't it? But actually, what might be happening in the implicate order at that level is that there were much more pervasive dynamics on move, which we could not be aware of because we were insensitive to them. And that's the relationship between the implicate and the explicate that is part of life. So the ecological systemic view of the social person is in the explicate order, and an informational view of energy and matter is in the implicate order. Now, just going back to this sculpture of the three women, this is a conversation, but the three people, can you see the expressions on their faces? They each have different angles on this conversation. One lady is pouring out her heart about the story. The one on the right is taking it all in and just absorbed with it. I don't know about you, but the one in the middle looks to me just a little bit skeptical, saying, yeah, maybe so, you know, but it's a little bit sitting back and, you know, so they've got three different minds that are forming different concepts of one dynamic that's going on between them. And what I'd like to point out to you, I don't know whether you've noticed it yourself, but have a look at their bodies and their legs. They're touching. There's a lot of contact going on between them. There's a lot of very subtle communication going on between them at a different level to what's going on in their minds. Yeah, that is a picture to me of the implicate order, out of which emerges our own individual perceptions of the explicate order. We then converse to try and team up and make sense and see it from your angle and see it from mine. And we very quickly forget that we're all part of something bigger and we're all connected already in it. And so this is a picture of three analytical perspectives that people can construct on a single dynamic amongst them all. And that these analytic perspectives, like the one in the middle, can make somebody take a mental step back from involvement in the conversation just to try and analyze, hey, what's going on here? Do I really believe this? You know, rather than being absorbed in it as the two ladies on the outside are absorbed in the exchange of information between them. So to me, this is a lovely picture of conversations. Now, I'm going to say just a little bit more about the actual event of the dream. So I mentioned before that they was putting up some traffic lights. I didn't say that, but 3 cars were stopped and the traffic lights were red. But then as I approached from behind, they changed to red and amber, which in England means, hey, get ready, we're going to be going soon. And on a motorbike, that's an absolute gift. You just, you know, accelerate away, overtake all 3 cars at the same time and zoom on ahead of the lot saying, hey, this is, you know, great life and so on. But actually, alerted by the dream, I was just about to start accelerating. And I know I stood on that brake and pulled back behind the last car. And then that front car did a spin in the road, roared off in the opposite direction. And what I didn't say before is that the car had black tinted windows. It was covered in dust. It just looked nasty. It wasn't a standard make of car. It had been worked on. It looked dangerous and it looked evil. There was intentional movement about it. That's the key term. There was intentional movement and it was evil. Now, that's what I've reflected on for years and years and years. And this, I would like to say, is very significant in why I moved from exploring wider spiritualities to feeling really comfortable with a Celtic approach to Christianity, not to the other formalized religions, which I believe have pushed things off to an extreme. But this earthed area of hospitality, of community, of relatedness, that's where the true spirituality lies. But the point about that encounter on the road, right, was that there were two personalities there. And the movements, the action that happened arose out of our personal values. My value was to take note of that dream. My value was to enhance life. My value is to explore what was going on. I don't know exactly what the values were that the driver of that car had, but they were not life enhancing. It was something that I would say is an attitude of deathlessness about it. And I think this is what convinced me that when we're looking at the implicate order and relatedness that goes beyond space and time as our explicate order brains construct and can emerge as a dream 1 month in advance of that, that alerts me in 2 stages of the dream to the fact that something dangerous is going to happen. In that implicate order, there are human values. The human values are embedded. And this is the point I really want to be making to you, that I'm not convinced that the best way of thinking about this implicate order is to try and call it consciousness or whatever. I think once we understand that human values are based in our hearts and direct our movements, direct our thoughts, direct the quality of our relationships and our reactions to each other, we're beginning to get ourselves earthed in the implicate order, not the explicate order. That's pre-orientation. And our hearts, a month before that, were somehow discerning something, that there's a direction that my life was going in, and this event could have ruined it. And whoever was driving that car was sensitive to the opposite move. So I have to say that this sense of personal value in the implicate order brings alive for me the conversational nature of reality. And we hide it, we lose it because of the way our brains orientate us in an explicate order of matter and substance. So hollow movement is the emerging as systemic personal identity. Now, just to say, I'm very fortunate that John Hunt Publishers have recently agreed to publish a book on this subject. So what I'm going to be going in to explain how I believe space and time can be conceived in a new way, coming out of this implicate order, is explained in much more detail in this book. The title is Clearing Away, Unveiling the Mental Tricks That Hide Reality. Now, I'm going to be giving you a very quick overview of what's in that book, but really there would be too much information here for you to try and take it in and really work on it. So I'm going to ask you just to sit back and take it a little bit like going to the cinema, where you're just sort of watching the story unfold. And then maybe at the end of it, you try and tie it all together. Be critical, do. I mean, this is, as I say, it's hypothesis. It's exploring what could be. Now, I've got a color coding in the next set of slides that are coming up. The black headings are when I'm talking about triquetral cosmology itself, the diversifying unity of life, that we're part of that dynamic. The red headings are about the concept of time. And there are 3 perspectives, like those 3 women, 3 perspectives can be constructed on timing, time, that construct an idea of timing. The blue headings go into the idea of space and substance as triquetral hollow movement. So that's the structure of what's coming up. And it's all about synergy as conversational orientation. When we enter into this communications feedback, at whatever level we want to consider things, synergic life starts to move within us. So there is too much for you to take on board here. So I really ask you not to try and take it on too much. But the point is that here I've shown the standard triquetra of how the brain gets organized. And here it is in this analytical direction. When somebody takes a mental step back from the conversation to think about the forms and objects, something strange happens inside the brain, the way things are orientated. And I'll go into this in much greater detail in the book to explain how it all happens in neurological terms as well, for those who are interested. But space and time become projected out of the observer identity. People become an observer of life when they look at the forms and objects. And the forms and objects take out with them the space and time, leaving inside this sense of personal identity my thought experience. And so an observer of life considers themselves to be a presence of mind. I am a presence of mind observing reality, and I retain within me how I change my relatedness to that external reality, which is the origin of the empirical frame of mind, the scientific empiricism. I can act on this objective world in any way I choose to, without any sense of moral obligation as being part of it, because I'm acting on it. Now, part of what comes with this is that the time frame here is an arrow of time, as I previously said, a linear cause-effect sequence of causality. Things move from the past to the future in the arrow of time. And so eternity, in this view, seems like an endless string of pictures, like an old cinema reel. And the present moment is one of these pictures in the middle, and it's slowly moving along this line. And spatial dimensions become the real context for life, not a product of life. So this is turned inside out. What is really the conversational experience, that the movement of relatedness generates space and time and a sense of reality. But when you take an analytical step back from the conversation, it looks as if I'm observing. My goodness. That's interesting. Are you hearing what I'm hearing? It's very pleasant music in the background. So that's the one particular analytical perspective, and of which linear time sequence becomes formed. This is what I call the structuralist perspective. When pushed to an extreme, it's the materialist perspective. This becomes material, but it doesn't have to be pushed to that extreme. But the structuralist perspective will tend to say that the dimensions of space and time are part of the objective reality. Now, if you take a mental step back to look at the conversation, looking at the changes that are going on there, the changes can get projected out as to my perceived reality. And that becomes like a whole chaos of processes and living souls who are making different choices, and I really don't know what's going on. But in here, the human identity, the personal identity becomes my own space, my personal bubble. In my personal space, I create information that I can push out into this chaos to bring order. And it's what I'm calling an informationist view of life. And in the last 50 years with information technology, this has become like the dominant way of looking at the world, that information is more important than matter. But it can be pushed to an extreme where the information is given an objectivity which it doesn't belong. The information, if you see it as a verb, is a dynamic that's going on between two things. So people in this view believe they have to construct information as a noun that they transmit into the chaos to alter the movement that's going on there. Now, in this one, time seems like a time frame. It's the story. You've got to have a beginning and a middle and an end, and I put stuff in that changes the story or makes the story. And so that's a totally different way, but it is still measurable, just like linear time is measurable. But these are actually different features in terms of the way the brain can construct a sense of time. Not spending too long on this now, but the third view, if one takes a mental step back from a conversation, to start looking at the qualities of relatedness that are going on in this conversation, something totally different happens in the brain. And if relatedness in an extreme can get pushed out to become an objective reality itself as a life force, a vitalist force, a spirit, a Tao, and that the common thing about all concepts of life forces from any culture around the world is that they all course through space. And they are like a higher power. They're a presence of a higher power to which individual people feel they must submit in order to come into a harmony with it for their health and their longevity, or whatever. Now, what I want to say here is that what is retained in the sense of personal identity, looking on this, is that I become a participator in a life that is beyond me. Yeah, and there's a lot in this. This is a vitally important analytical perspective. And I need to say very clearly at this point, by identifying these three perspectives, I'm not saying any of them is right or wrong. They are all equally justifiable in logical terms. But the difficulty is, if they get pushed to an extreme, there are logical deductions that are not compatible with each other. And the one here is that because the personal identity has change of form retained as part of its identity, this is this concept of my own time, and I can return to eternity and come back again in a changed form. And this is logically consistent with this particular view on life, this perspective on life. So reincarnation is logical in this perspective, but in the materialist perspective, is totally illogical. And in the individualist perspective, the informationist, it's an interesting idea, but it's neither here nor there, whether it happens or not. So these perspectives give very different pictures of what's going on in life. And I'm going to say this again, in any one of these analytical perspectives, you can get a view into the whole of life and see the whole of life in that perspective and make sense of it as far as it'll go. But as soon as you try to integrate it with the way that it looks from another perspective, you'll run into problems. And people then, sadly, end up criticizing each other and blaming each other and running each other down, saying you're wrong, rather than you've got an interesting perspective. Can we compare those and see if we can match them to find common ground? And that is what this triquetral model is all about. It's about being able to recognize the different analytical perspectives, but then to bring them together, to explore how to integrate them into a way that we can delve into the implicate order of life, to understand it better, to really connect better into it. So please, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that any one of these is wrong. They're all equally justifiable, but they each can only be right as far as they go. They can't be the whole truth without trying to match it with the others. And here we're still on the red heading. I'd just like to, for a moment, ask you to think back again to that incident with the driver in the car and myself on the motorbike. Just think about the dream and the event. I just described three different approaches to time. One is the eternal now throughout life, and that we can move from eternity into the now and get a very big picture of who I am in the whole picture. The other is of time frames. There's a story going on here. How extensive is that time frame? How extensive is the story? And then there's time sequence. Was there a time sequence? Yes, there certainly was. There are time sequences going on through that story. All three of them are relevant as we reflect on that unusual event. So a triquetral relational balance can avoid dualisms, because all those three perspectives construct a sort of a dualism. And avoiding dualisms can be found by reflecting in what I call a gap in time between the seconds of your mind. We're now connecting with that poem. Between the seconds of the mind, there is beauty, such as always found. In the world, it can be beautiful, but also personal values can create chaos or turmoil that can actually create danger, difficulty. And the implicate order is basically a life-enhancing order that generates life and can bring healing and restoration, even when people's values cause destruction and brokenness. So this is the last slide on time and timing. So we're talking about three different perspectives. The timing of decisions. Some of you may know the Zen archer and arrow paradox, that the archer and the arrow are all one concept. If you now think about the three analyses This is how we get into interaction, the aiming of that. Why is somebody tensioning it? They have a purpose in mind. The tension is both in the person and in the bow. The release of that arrow is a decision in linear time that the time is right. There's a story about the whole context in which this action is being tensioned and aligned. This is Karen Barrad's intra-action. And in this triquetral concept of movement, if you're in what's called a positivist view, that there are little bits of matter like atoms and so on that actually has their own reality, that's the positive view of the world. People talk about, well, what sets these things in movement? And this movement of what? These bits exist, but what brings the movement? But triquetral cosmology is turning that upside down and saying that what the things, matter, emerges out of movement. It's emergent order from implicate order. And this is process philosophy. It's the emergence and dispersal of pattern forms among inform energy movement, reshaping and releasing continuously as that archer and arrow is doing. Which means that when we start looking at quantum physics or mechanics or whatever you want to call it, we're not looking at a quantum of energy, as if energy is something that is pre-existent. We're looking at quantum change, a small package of change, right, which can scale up by further entanglements to create movement out of which particles and waves emerge, and the whole explicate order eventually emerges in which we are interactive. So there's a few slides now looking at what is the concept of space and of substance into which this movement is, in which we're part of the movement. Now, the triquetra actually has two forms. There are two. In knot theory shows that it has a left spin and a right spin, clockwise or anti-clockwise. And here you can see the one. Here, this line comes down in front of that one, and here it comes down behind it. This is knot theory. And they have different dynamics. Now, they're each equal in terms of movement, but there's a different structure to it. So just moving on, when they pair up, this is, again, the core icon is a double triquetra. This is where a single triquetra actually gains existence. A single quantum change has no existence on its own. But when that change starts to communicate with another in a conversational reality, it becomes a vibration. One becomes an ecology for the other. This is the core element of existence. Now, when I started making 3D printed models of these, I discovered the most remarkable thing, that the left and the levo and dextro, L and D resonant quanta, when diverse quanta fit together, the four ligands that remain on the outside of it lie in a horizontal two-dimensional plane. But if you get an LL and a DD, so this here is an L form, that one is going behind that one, and that one is an L form, that one's going behind that one. So this is LL, and this one, the ligand has to twist in order to allow bidirectional informational flow, which means that the four ligands that come off from it orientate in different directions. And here, I'm going to make the bold claim, we are seeing the origin of the three dimensions of space. It is the movement of these entanglements that has to twist in order to preserve a harmonic vibration. If that could not twist, there would be no harmonic. It would stop vibrating. Each triquetral change would separate and break up and disperse, process philosophy. But as it is, when there is harmonic, it becomes the core of existence. Now, in quantum computing, they need three core states called plus, minus, and zero. And I would, without going into this, I'd like to propose that these three core double triquetra are probably what these core quantum states are, called qubits, qubits of information. So I actually call them informational qubits to try and emphasize that it's movement and not a substance, and not an object in itself. They're synergic resonant movements vibrations at the Planck length, that really small length of quantum change. Now here we are not going to spend long on this, but when these scale up further and entangle into long strings, we end up with 3 different types of wave. And can you see the side ligands from this? All of these are blue. I really have no time to explain this, but the book will in greater detail. All I can say is that these waves can develop a 4th dimension movement along the wave, backwards and forwards, like a slinky going along the wave. And that 4th dimension movement can add time into the 3 dimensions of space. And in fact, there can be lots more spins and twists and curls and so on of these sort of things, which add extra dimensions of movement. And I would like to be proposing to you that the various dimensions of M theory and string theory are actually different types of movement at different scales, scaling up in a spin foam of these waves that are connecting with each other. I'm not going to go into the details here, but when you get the LD diverse stable qubits, they make a horizontal flat plane and it turns into a hexagon. I've made models of these, a flat hexagon. And these waves of gravity and light and heat are running through this as a standing wave rather than progressing from it. I'm going to have to move on. But here, this picture shows how you can get a progressive wave of any sort, and stable domains can come off the edge of it. And I'd like to propose to you that these stable domains, as I call them, are the seeds of particles. We'll go on to the next slide to see that. But a single stable domain can have several different waves coming off it, and the waves can crisscross with each other, making a spin foam. And all of this is movement. All of this is movement. Informational movement, making a spin foam of the implicate order, out of which one area becomes diverse from another, so you get informational transfer between them. The one area knows what's going on somewhere else in a synergic network. Informational quantum movement because of the utter interrelatedness of implicate order behind patterned matter that is in constant change. And it's the bidirectionality of movement. Now, the single hexagon can extend into a honeycomb of stable domains all mixing together. And the standing waves of heat and light and gravity can move through this. This is the closest picture that I can get to of the implicate order, but it gets more complex than this. Now imagine that this is a flat thing. I've made a model of this, but this extended stable domain, there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't curl topologically in on itself, in which case you can get these waves that might span internally within that topological pattern. And those become the internal forces of a particle, or whatever scale of particle you want to come to. So those waves, those 3 basic triquetral waves, can either become progressive waves spanning the whole cosmos in terms of light waves and gravity, or they can become the internal strong forces and weak forces that make particles and matter hold together. But then also, if these extended stable domains are curling around to make particles, some of them will be very stable and some could be unstable. And that is what I believe are particles are emerging out of this implicate order and scaling up into atoms, scaling up into molecules, scaling up into macromolecules, which form into cell membranes and the components of cells, which form the microtubules, which help to move the amoeba to move through the environment and respond to its environment more widely, which help mitochondria, bacteria, to find a home inside cells and generate energy. That all of this is going on in a cell which scales up into a higher order organism, which interrelate, and they breed and create more and create families that communicate, all around identical principles of movement. Movement is the changing relatedness of pattern forms at every level, emergent from the implicate order. Now, in current quantum theory, I don't think there's any theory around that actually adequately explains how gravity and light can interact. But this particular model shows that this is quite a complicated one to understand, but I ran pipe cleaners through this model of 2 waves interacting. The orange one is a gravitational wave, The green one is a light wave, and both of them share a relatedness ligand. Now, this looks as if one wave is passing through another, but that's the wrong picture of the implicate order. The implicate order is a harmonic. It's a spin phone network in which there's, or I would like to claim, synchronicity between two ends of a wave. What becomes linear time is the movement of the fourth dimensional wave along these triquetral waves, as I call them. The triquetral waves are forming a spin phone network, the implicate order. And through that implicate order can move linear waves, and those are what science measures. Science can compare one fourth dimension wave with another, but it has no way of delving into the true nature of the implicate order. We can only discern this by scaling our human experience of being together in groups in conversations where there's informational transfer in a brain that is designed to interpret it using these three principles. That's what I'm proposing. So this is an informational model of movement in quantum gravity. It's happening in every cell and every cell membrane of your body, including every nerve cell. Every synapse in your brain is moving according to these principles. The microtubules also move brain neurotransmitters to the synapse and release them at the synapse. It's the same chemistry that moves an amoeba and that is moving atoms and molecules that are on movement. Everywhere above absolute zero is in movement. So this universe is a cosmos because it births life in its diverse ecologies. And we belong in this ecology with others. We are not here on our own. The conversational nature of life is something that we really need to appreciate. That when you look at an object, you are seeing a brain construct of changing relatedness, a whole history of changing relatedness that we're interpreting as an object so we can talk about it and manipulate it. But actually, it's evidence of the fact that we belong in this cosmos. We're in it, we're interactive within it. Triquetral quantum cosmology, the inner human heart is deeply synergic with life's movements in a much wider concept than our explicate order brains can take in. The conscious mental experience of orientation adds dimensional space and time, right? But we have a meaningful engagement with relational life beyond space and time. That's the implicate order in our inner hearts. Inform energy is life moving in the background that we connect into. And we try to make sense of it, like those three women in the conversation. We try to make sense of it from our different perspectives. But there is life on the go. And we need the conversations to try and really grasp what is actually going on. Now, the final thing before I just close is that image that I gave you of the implicate order, I haven't gone into this. The book will go into this in much greater detail so you can to properly explain it. But imagine a group of people. Imagine those three women talking, but imagine you're in a group of people having a conversation about the day's events or planning where you want to go on holiday next and so on. The exchanges that are going on between you, there's a whole raft of communications at an implicate pre-orientation level below the orientation horizons. All those communications are going on, passing things back and forward about our values. We then construct this impression of trying to make sense of what's going on. Now, I'm not going to spend long on this, but gravitational waves, gravity holds together diverse places of the universe. There's an enduring connection between every mass in the universe. Now, that to me is, in the human experience, could emerge as the equivalent of love. Love is enduring connection between people, an enduring ability to be responsive to each other, even though there might be fairly traumatic changes going on or fairly disturbing changes, or maybe anticipating very pleasant changes. But that enduring sense of connection could be an equivalent of gravitational attraction. The warmth, the thermodynamics of responsiveness, the warmth could be the equivalent of human kindness. that as we respond to each other, as we're in this group together, we maybe discern our differences, but there can still be a warmth of responsiveness, a kindness that says, well, I can respond to you and, keep this connection warm and alive. But also there is the sense of presence. We can be present for each other, or when somebody's distracted and isn't really involved in the conversation, it. And people sometimes take themselves away, they hide themselves away, they don't allow themselves to be a presence in a social network. And this is rather equivalent to the electromagnetic type waves, where electromagnetism causes two polarities. I haven't been able to go into that at all, I'm afraid, in this talk, but the D and the L waves can run through this network parallel to each other and will have opposite effects. So you can have attraction or repulsion between positive and negative charges, and magnetism, north and south poles, and so on. But why should all that matter be dualistic, separated from our hearts, from our inner hearts? We're embedded in it. We're intuiting it. We're communicating about it. We're trying to understand it by talking with people who see it differently and trying to edge towards a better understanding of it. And we need to be the presence of loving kindness for each other. And that is a substantial reality of a human being in this world. That is the core substantial reality of a human being in this world, to be the presence of loving kindness for others in social settings, or with the earth, or with God, or whatever the spirituality is that is alive for you at that time. And of course, the love, unfortunately, does not always feel like that comfortable, warm, cuddly joy of love when things are going together. Love also is made known as grief, where there's brokenness, where there's separation, where there's misunderstanding or doubt, or there's been offense taken or hurt. That love turns into a grief mode, which we teach about in other areas, that it actually has a positive purpose, a constructive purpose, to help people to explore how to reconnect into that enduring connection when change has pushed people out of a comfort zone. But nevertheless, that grief can move people to explore. And if we have the warmth of kindness, and we recognize someone is grieving, and we can be present for them, then we can contribute to the healing of this world. The explicate order can get tied up in knots, and we can help to untangle that. We can be the presence of loving kindness, and we will be connecting into this implicate order, discerning intuitively what the movements of that order are, what the values are that we need to bring alive in our relationships now. So this is the conclusion of what the triquetral cosmology brings us to, a concept that the human heart is much more formative of our lives than our conscious minds, which we need to connect with others in conversations in order to discern and delve deeper into what's happening in our human hearts in terms of values and interactions. So I've just come back to that original slide, the iconic slide of triquetral cosmology. Two self-organizing units that are in communication with each other. There is a mutual transformation that is synergic. That is life emerging. And that synergy we become an ecology for each other. And that can bring forth fruitfulness in life after that. So this, I believe, I'm going to come back now to the final slide, is the implicate order within which mysterious things can happen, things beyond space and time, things in which substance disappears. But I'd like to say to you that that inspiration that I had to write that poem, and just think, this is now 50 years ago, angles turn and lines forgive, crisscrossing of the mind. I didn't know about Triquetra when I wrote that. Angles turn and lines forgive, crisscrossing of the mind. For here in the world there is beauty, such as always found between the seconds of your mind. So thank you. That's what I'd like to be sharing with you.
Thank you very much indeed, Trevor. That was fascinating. and I think it'll take us a little bit of time to get our heads around your new concepts, but I find them very, very fruitful, especially as they relate to to David Bohm. And I just did a couple of remarks before we have a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back to announcements and questions. One form of pattern recognition that I would associate with David Bohm would be meaning. And maybe we can come back to that in the thought, because he was meaning and being he talked about, and he didn't like the mind matter idea. He put everything into a different form. So that was one observation, and the other two observations are related to Ian McGilchrist, because I think the brain that makes matter and substance is effectively the left hemisphere cognition. And the right hemisphere is what enables us to understand betweenness.
Yes.
Betweenness is crucial to your model. It's also crucial to his. And I'd just like you to tell us, or clarify for us, how exactly you would define the inner human heart. I didn't quite get that clear. You used the term a lot.
Yes.
But is it the intuition? Is it the what is it exactly? How do you have a definition for it?
Well, I think it is going to need clarification in a fairly extended way, but one way is to distinguish what in our human experience is not actually orientated in space and time. So below the orientation horizon, if you think how much do you imagine you are embedded in this explicate order world, right, around you, that's above the orientation horizon. But there's a lot of experience to do with intuition, sensing, that is not framed in that way.
Yeah, so it's subtle. It's subtle.
It's very subtle. Yeah, it's nuanced, it's dynamic in its movement. And it is exactly as David Bohm was saying, it's about meaning. I'm aware that there's some dynamic going on inside me, but I cannot believe that I am isolated in this world, this cosmos. Right? What is this natural connection? Where do I belong in it? Because what I see with my senses, what is constructed into this implicate order, is not the whole story. You know,
and that's very much Ian's perspective as well. That you have to think that we emerge from within something, and we're not apart from it.
Absolutely, totally.
And that's in his whole chapter on the sense of the sacred. Makes this point. Anyway, we're going to have a break now. So back at 50, and then we'll have some brief announcements, and then I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions.
Thank you.
Great.
I think what popped in my mind when I was reading a lot of the what if questions, it certainly is true that I believe the explicate order that our brains construct. Everybody knows about the blind spot, how our brain sort of fills in consciously where there is no sensory input to the retina. And we have all sorts of anticipations in life that make us focus our attention in various ways and screen out other things. And that's more the way I look on this informational processing, is because of our focus of attention, we screen certain things out. And I believe that the whole brain works on feedback loops. And we end up a little bit like that film, The Matrix, making our own reality in a way. So that's what those three analytical perspectives are, that the more you push yourself down that line of maintaining your focus on certain areas of life, the more you become separated from the ongoing implicate order conversational reality. Yeah, you go off into your own mental world, and you can talk with like-minded people, and it'll sound as if everything's sensible and you're seeing it all together. But there will always be a limit to that one perspective. Just as the Galileo project is saying, there's a definite limit to materialism, but what can we explore alternatively? That's the same is true. If you take the vitalist view to an extreme, I'm afraid to say, while I am a great believer in that participatory view of life, I don't believe I can just think it all into existence. I'm not sure that, I think there is a material reality out there. that implicate order actually is making particles and waves, and the particles scale up into things that do behave deterministically. Now, we can work with that at different levels, but the idea that just with our conscious minds, we can sort of dissolve it, I just feel that's maybe gone a step too far. There's sort of a middle ground of paradox that we need to be living in, where that's why we need the conversations, to explore that middle ground.
Very good. I mean, what you're saying also is redolent of Bergson, because Bergson said the brain is the organ of attention to life, and part of that attention is exclusion.
Yes.
And if we took in all the information that we potentially could, we'd be completely overloaded. I mean, we're already overloaded, but we'd be completely swamped.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you. So what I'd like to do, if I could just sort of build on this point a bit more, I said the brain works on feedback loops. Now, I personally believe that, and you're asking before my concept of the inner human heart. I think many people are aware that decisions, choices are made emotionally. Yeah, they're made through the limbic brain and the core brain, which is pulling together all sorts of associations. And sales psychology, of course, is expert at this. They know how to influence the emotions to encourage
so does
sales.
the government.
Yeah? Right. Yes, thank you. And so the decisions are formed by feedback loops between the core brain and the limbic brain and the cerebral cortex. But also coming into the core brain is all of our sensory input. And there are filters in the core brain that filter the sensory input on its way up. And the outgoing motor outputs feed those filters. They put a priority, and that's part of the attention focusing mechanism. Yeah, which of course, neurolinguistic program is very strong on all of that sort of filtering of information. Now, that's what I believe the values are. They're actually the priming of filters in the core brain and the limbic brain that allow through certain things that we're anticipating or magnify things that don't fit with it, mismatches, so that our attention focuses on what is not going right, so we can target our activity towards that purpose, the purpose that we have in mind. The problem is the purpose we have in mind is our purpose, not the bigger purpose of the universe. Yeah.
Yes, well, there may be some sort of alignment there, but we can't tell.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's move on to the next question. So Julie Henshelwood, does the implicate order imply potential? This is 2105. It's quite a short question.
I think an absolutely core thing that's going on for me is that discovery, or the Nobel Prize in 2011, which they had proved that the universe is still expanding at an ever-increasing rate. The universe is an open system. And again, in the book, I would go into how I believe the triquetral model allows the open generation of new areas, new substance even. That my experience of life, and I have had these personal experiences, is that substance can transform miraculously. I simply have to say that is my experience. That does not fit with the laws of science and the laws of thermodynamics. So there is something about open system thinking, which, as Julie is saying, is all about growth and opportunity and potential. And the potential can grow, but through conversational interaction, it can stabilize. Those stable domains are absolutely the core of what makes life sustainable, right? So there's a constant movement, and those stable domains can form and they can disrupt and they can split, but nevertheless, the fact that they stabilize movement and change, and that can scale up to a level of predictability and determinism, also allows, because it's rooted in movement, it allows the miraculous and unusual transformation of those stabilities.
I think that's the key point, really. And as I said, with David Bohm, you're starting from the dynamic hollow movement. And I was just bowled over when I read The Implicate Order in about 1983. He spoke at the Mystics and Scientists conference that year, in fact, with
Right.
Ruth Sheldrake. And I'm also thinking that the closed closed system is associated with linear thinking and a linear idea of time. So I think this is as it were systemic, if I'm understanding you
Yes.
properly, because once you've got an open system, you're also open into consciousness is our access means for the whole of what we're talking about. But once you're open outwards and inwards, if one can even make that distinction.
I'm just totally with that. But it all depends on our sensitivities and our willingness to create gaps in time so that we can just step back from all of our constructs and just engage with new sensitivities. But then we need to affirm that through conversations with others who see life differently, because otherwise we just go off into our own imaginary worlds. If we do that, we need this conversational interaction to find our own stabilities.
Then we are coming on to Peter from Scotland, where it's still light. It's totally dark.
Yes, indeed, it's light. But I'd like some light cast on my problem, if I might.
Right.
I'm going to, I can't formulate it properly for you, so I ask you to be very tolerant with what I'm saying, because I haven't come to a full understanding of what we're doing. A number of us, and Vasilios is one of them, are looking at random number generators. And we're looking at the way they go out of randomness. Now, what is interesting about this is that we're looking at what happens when people die. And we have reason to think that this will be a point at which the random numbers will go out of randomness. And also, and this is much more interesting, much more important, is that you link random number generators to specific people and specific events by forming a relationship with them and the event. So that's three events. There's the generator, there's the event, and there is you who is doing it. And it seems to me that there is going to, as time moves on, the relationship between the random number generators and people and events are going to increase enormously. You'll have one in your pocket and you will to some extent see the intensity of what somebody is thinking. Also, time is immaterial and space is immaterial. Now, with that rather poorly formulated question, can you help?
I'm really not sure what a random number generator physically is. It's presumably a mini computer.
Correct.
And what is the actual product? What form does the number? Remember, so my model about hollow movement at the implicate order is that it's the changing relatedness of formed patterns, but the formed patterns are of movement. There are cyclical, synergic, spins or vibrations or progressions of energy through the spin foam. So what does the random number generator do?
It produces streams of noughts and ones and noughts and ones. And these are either totally random, as the pattern you get, or in fact, they're less random, they have structure in them. And the structure seems to be given remotely, and there is space is not counted. And
okay, thanks. So as you were telling your story, describing the situation, what popped into my mind was the time when I was using the I Ching and thinking about divination. And there are other settings and religious settings in which people try to divine what is the dynamic that's going on in hollow movement or in the implicate order. And I came to think that there's no need to use sticks and stones to do that. If our hearts are open to a relationship with the implicate order, we should be able to increase our sensitivities enough to be able to discern intuitively, wise courses of action. Now, I'm just wondering whether you're describing the opposite, which is that if I have made a relationship with an electronic random number generator, right, that relationship with it actually brings my heart level values. And here I would say, rather than my thoughts, I'm repeatedly going to come back to my values, would bring my values into a dynamic relationship with whatever the quantum level substance of your random number generator is. I can't really be more precise than that.
I wonder whether there's a form of entanglement going on here.
Yes, thank you. That's probably a helpful word there. Yeah. Yes.
Because in other words, you become somehow related to the dynamics of the system, which you aren't initially, but you become so through interacting.
Yes, it's a little bit like the biofeedback system. Maybe. But if you have a belief that this random number generator is something you can have a relationship with, then perhaps you can.
That, I think, is an interesting premise, because, and in fact, I think I'm right in saying, Peter, that the skeptics trying to do this often have negative correlations.
Some do, yes.
Yes, there we go. We create our own realities.
You see, that's really interesting. Okay, Peter, thanks so much. Let's go on to, actually, before I go on to Bernard, I just want to ask
Trevor.
This question from Craig Hyenga about the comparison of your triquetras with trefoil knots.
Yes.
And he talked a bit about that. So maybe you could just say a little bit about that.
Yes, we looked at that. The first computer-assisted design models that we were making, the guy who was doing it assumed that I was talking about a trefoil. And the mathematics of a trefoil has been extremely well worked out. They know all the formulae of the different curves of it. And so he thought, well, this is simple. We just string trefoils together. And it just didn't work at all. The reason being that a trefoil, what is a point on a triquetra is an angle that turns internally or becomes a ligand that extends into a neighboring triquetra. Right? It's a movement that either angles in on itself and reflects internally, or it becomes part of a synergy with an entangled one. Now, trefoil, that angle is actually a curve. Now, it's more like a ribbon that curls around and goes back in. And it definitely is the same sort of eternal movement. There's no question of that. They're both describing eternal movement. But the trefoil doesn't include within it a model by which it can entangle. And we proved that because we tried and failed.
Good. Okay, I think we'll just leave it at that because we've only got 10 minutes or so and there's still people in the queue.
Thank you.
And it's our President Bernard Carr next.
Right. Hello, Bernard.
Hello, Trevor. Trevor, thank you. I enjoyed your talk very much, but there was quite a lot to take in, and I don't understand all of it. So, so I was particularly interested, of course, in the emphasis you put on the triquetra and all these beautiful diagrams. Of course, I'm aware of triquetra as a sort of Celtic symbol, but I hadn't seen it applied in all these ways, and I really like the way you're applying it in all these different contexts, both in as a representation of particle physics, a representation of the brain, a representation of relationships. It also reminded me a bit of DNA, and I was wondering if you could apply it to life in some sense, but that could be a big question. But the more specific question was, being a physicist, of course, I was particularly interested in what you said in terms of its relationship to string theory, really, and quantum gravity. And you made references to spin foam. But I couldn't quite work out to what extent you've really worked this out as a physical theory, and to what extent it's just sort of a qualitative discussion. Have you had any feedback from string theorists on this sort of approach?
No, right. No, you put your finger on the issue here, because remember, I'm starting from a neurophysiological angle. Yeah, I'm starting from the level of human dynamics, of systems of people. and the way they communicate and how they get into habits and routines and so on, how you can break those habits. And I've described in that principles of organization. That's the key term. And then realize that those principles scale up and scale down. And of course, my studies have taken me scaling down into cellular chemistry, macromolecular chemistry, atomic, and quantum. I'm new to. Everybody's new to it, really, aren't we? We're all guessing our way through it. But what I'm saying, my theory, my hypothesis, is that these principles of organization that the brain has evolved to engage with so that we can have consistent social relationships. Yeah, that's the theory. That same set of principles can scale right down into an implicate order with entanglements that is an order of movement which comes below the level of any itty bitty, building block. Yeah, that it is the movement that's primary, that as those entangle, because of the sine wave ligands that form between them, it generates the 3 dimensions of space. It actually generates those. But then where you get it stringing out into along what I call a triquetral wave, just like a slinky, you can get a 4th dimension wave moving along it. Yeah. So if the stable domain curls into a particle which is held together by internal waves, you can get a vibration of that particle. That's a 5th dimension. You can get vibrations between particles. That's a 6th dimension. Any ligand can spin. That's a 7th dimension. I don't know. No, here I'm guessing. So you're absolutely right. This is a qualitative model at the moment. And I set off, once I was working on it, I set off on a search to find a quantum physicist who would help me to apply their mathematics to this model, to see that if it does match experimental findings, and so we can then modify it according to experimental findings. And I will simply say, over a year's search, I have not found a single quantum physicist who's willing to talk to me. So
maybe Vasilios will talk to you.
I'd love to. I'm on a search for one, but it needs to. This is very much angular mechanics and so on. The whole lot is curving all the time.
Yeah. Well, of course, I'm very fascinated also with what you just said about the link with dimensions, and indeed the links with hard dimensions, which is one of my own interests. Yeah. I just one little point you made at the beginning, which I sort of disagree with, which I'll just say very quickly. When you talked about the link between open systems and the acceleration of the universe, I wasn't really convinced by that, because it is true, of course, that the universe is accelerating. But I mean, even if the universe wasn't accelerating, you still have this concept that you can violate the second law of thermodynamics because of, chaos theory and things, nonlinear effects, because you can locally form ever-increasing levels of complexity simply because you're not violating the second law of thermodynamics globally, because it's just a small fraction of the universe involved in this increasing structure. So I wasn't really convinced by that argument. In other words, even if the universe hadn't been accelerating, I reckon your argument would still go through.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you, Bernard, because that would fit with the way. Again, we're not going to have time to go into this now, but again, in the book I do. But I actually believe that an extending triquetral wave moving into nothingness can actually induce movement in nothingness, right? Can actually, and we actually could look at the process of continuous creation through that sort of dynamic that's changing. Never mind the details of that. It comes back down to another couple of Zen paradoxes in the way that all works. But what you're saying is that, yes, at any locality, at any locality, that same dynamic could be happening. And that is why the universe would be expanding at an ever increasing rate, because it is also happening in micro localities. Yeah, that's how the expansion is happening at an increasing rate, because it's happening everywhere. So I'm totally in agreement with you that yes, the chaos complexity principles can scale up in any locality. And the problem is when mentally we make closed systems and believe we can experiment on it, right? And that experiment tells us the truth. It doesn't. It tells us what goes on in the closed system that we've created.
Yes, I think we've only got 5 minutes left. I think that it would be well worth trying to develop this in within the context of a working group within the Galileo Commission, and Vasilios, can be in touch about this, because I think there's a lot of very interesting detail to be worked out here, and which really needs a much more extended conversation than we're able to have in this context of some kind of questions and answers.
Well, David, thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, Jerome sent a message to me saying, does it need a special interest group? But I think it's probably more within the Galileo Commission. And so I'll put you and Vasily in touch to talk about that. Bernard, thank you very much indeed.
Yes, thank you, Bernard.
Trevor, thank you very much. It's been an incredibly rich evening, also from the questions. A couple of points. One, I'm put in mind of Gregory Bateson, Pattern That Connects.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I mean, it's always worth going back to Gregory Bateson, because he has such an incredibly fertile scientific mind.
Amazing, absolutely amazing.
And so I'm sure you'll find new connections there. And then the other observation is the relationship between the implicate and the implicit, and the tacit. Sorry, Sheila, we haven't got time for any further questions. As with David Bohm, the implicate or the implicit is what's enfolded or tacit, and I'm using tacit in the sense of Michael Polanyi's the tacit dimension, the tacit and the explicit. And so when David Bohm talks about this, when we explain something, we unfold it into the explicate order, because to explain literally means to unfold, explicatory. And I think this whole metaphor of implicit, explicit, implicate, explicate is extraordinarily fruitful. And what you've done is to multiply its dimensions and put it into a variety of contexts, which I think is extremely fertile. And what I also very much like, which is something we all need to do, and again, Ian McGilchrist does this in his new book, primacy of process, primacy of relationship, primacy of betweenness. And we got so used to our sort of subject predicate, distinction, our dualistic inner mind matter, that where even our language and logic is structured, so that you've got subject and predicate. And Bohm kept on saying, what about the verb? The dynamism of the verb is in fact the most important element, defining the relationship between the subject and the predicate. And Rick Tarnas is very good on explaining the origins of this in his book, the Passion of the Western Mind, the background of Aristotle and how Aristotle codified Greek logic. Absolutely fascinating. I haven't read it for years, but it just sort of came to mind. So as I say, I think let's get a group going within the Galileo Commission. I think you've sent some resources. I know there are some people who will very much want to be in touch with you personally, and we'll take it forward from there. So thank you very much again. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Jerome, for the backup and all that goes on behind the scenes to make these webinars possible. And
thank you again.